In 1984, my brother Daniel left a note on his kitchen table that said he'd be back Tuesday or Wednesday. Tuesday came. So did Wednesday. The door stayed locked. The plants in his window were dying, and the answering machine blinked 0. The last thing he wrote, "Gone to Crater Lake. Don't worry." But there's something about silence that stops feeling peaceful after a while, especially when it follows you. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your own hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Rachel Whitaker. I run a little bookstore just off Haight Street in San Francisco. I've been here nearly 20 years. Before that, I was a copy editor, and before that, I was Daniel's big sister. He was always quiet even as a kid, thoughtful, independent in a way most people aren't. He liked facts more than small talk, trees more than crowds, but he was kind. He showed up when it mattered. That August in 1984, he told a friend he needed a few days of stillness. No people, no noise. He packed light he always did. Just boots, a stove, a small tent, and his old field journal. Signed the trail register at Crater Lake on the morning of August 12th. The ranger on duty barely looked up when Daniel handed the clipboard back. I didn't know he was gone yet. Not really. That week I was running a weekend book sale, and Daniel being off-grid for a few days wasn't anything new. But by the 6th day, things started feeling off. He hadn't shown up at work. His landlord said his rent envelope was still sealed behind the mail slot. The milk in his fridge had gone bad, and the apartment felt stale, like no one had breathed there in a long time. I found the note on his table. Back Tuesday or Wednesday, don't worry. But it was Saturday. I called the ranger station at Crater Lake. The woman on the line sounded distracted. Yeah, he signed in. August 12th. Rim to summit. Expected back on the 14th. I asked if he'd signed out. She said no. Sometimes hikers go off schedule. If he's not back by tomorrow, we'll escalate. I remember the way she said escalate. Like a formality. Like an asterisk. On Monday morning, they started the search. 2 rangers walked the rim trail. A helicopter scanned the ridge. His car, a rust-red Subaru, was still parked where his permit said he'd leave it. Inside trail mix, a folded map, a photo of the 2 of us in Yosemite from 1978. But nothing else. No boot prints, no tent, no gear, no body. I stayed in Oregon for a month, made flyers, joined search crews, slept at a roadside motel in Klamath Falls, whispering his name into the motel ceiling every night like it might echo somewhere back to him. After 30 days, the park closed the file. Missing, presumed deceased. That phrase sits in a strange place in the throat, like it knows it's lying. I returned to San Francisco with only one thing, his last postcard to me. It read, "The lake is quieter than I imagined. Just me, the wind, and a ridge that feels like the end of the world. Wish you could see it. D." I read it every year on August 12th, and for 13 years, nothing happened. Until the fall of 1997, when a ranger hiking an old fire path found something buried under moss near Hematite Ridge. Not a body, a tent, still zipped. And inside it, his boots, side by side, like he'd stepped out for just a moment, and never came back. The ranger who found the tent was named Miles Kernan. I didn't remember him at first, but the second we met standing under that yellow canopy at Hematite Ridge, it came back. He'd been younger in '84, less gray, less quiet. Now he moved with the kind of caution you only learn from walking the same woods for decades. He said they'd found Daniel's camp by accident. A seasonal recruit had noticed something odd along a path they weren't even scheduled to patrol. A ring of stones at the base of a split cedar. Man-made. Recently disturbed. Miles knelt beside it and found the edge of Daniel's tent beneath the moss. That was all it took to bring everything back. The tent was crushed, but mostly intact. The boots had been placed at the flap, not tossed, not scattered, placed. There was no blood, no drag marks, just an eerie stillness like someone had stepped out mid-thought. Inside, they found a sleeping bag half-zipped, a plastic water bottle half full, a camp stove still packed in its case. Nothing stolen, nothing broken. 5 feet away, under the shallow drift of pine needles, they uncovered a sealed metal box. Inside was Daniel's field notebook. The first few pages described the hike, the weather, how quiet it was. Then came the last entry dated August 15th. It said, "Saw someone today on the ridge. Not a ranger. Didn't wave back. Just stood there, still watching. I think something's off." The sentence trailed mid-word. That was the last thing he wrote. The ink was faded but dry. The notebook had been packed before the fall storms came. He knew something was wrong. Miles didn't say that part out loud, but we both understood it. The tent and gear were logged, photographed, sealed. And then I got the call I'd stopped expecting. I was in the back of my store reshelving travel memoirs when the phone rang. The moment I heard the words, "We found your brother's campsite," my legs stopped moving. Not his remains, not his pack. His campsite. I drove straight to Crater Lake. 12 hours. No stops. The ranger station hadn't changed. Same wood paneling, same faded trail maps. But no one behind the counter recognized the name Whitaker anymore. The woman handed me a pass and said, "They're waiting for you at Hematite Ridge." It's a strange thing seeing a place where someone vanished, where their life paused and the world kept going. The trees were taller than I remembered. The air smelled the same pine bark, cold stone. Miles met me there. He took off his hat when he saw me. Said, "I remember you." I said, "I remember you too." Then he showed me the items. They were laid out carefully, not like evidence, but like memory. The tent, Daniel's boots, the journal. I asked if they'd found anything else. He shook his head. No body, no bones, no sign of struggle. It's like he walked away. That's when I noticed a trail. Narrow, almost invisible behind the brush, not marked on any of the maps. I asked if anyone had followed it. Miles said it wasn't official, not safe, no radio signal. I told him I wanted to see it. We moved slowly. The trail was more suggestion than path, barely there between the trees. After 10 minutes, the forest opened into a small clearing, and at the center was something that didn't belong. A wooden structure, no taller than a man's waist, built from bark stacked in a strange shape. A shrine. On top sat a river stone painted with a streak of faded red. Beside it, a scrap of torn nylon, sun-bleached and brittle. Tan. The same color as Daniel's tent. This wasn't from wildlife. Someone made this. Deliberately, ritualistically. Miles crouched beside it, brushing moss from the base. His voice was quiet when he said, "It's not recent." But someone kept it up for years. And then I saw something else carved low into the bark of a nearby tree. D.W. August 1984. My brother left that tent. He came this way. But why leave his gear? Why not return? I didn't say the other question out loud, the one that followed me back to the ranger station, clinging to me like the forest air. What if he didn't leave willingly? The next morning, Miles pulled a set of older case files from the archive room. Each folder stamped in red unresolved missing persons, names I'd never heard, faces I didn't recognize. But the patterns, they were familiar. All solo hikers, all last seen near Daniel's route. One man in 79, another in 82. A woman with a camera who vanished without a trace. No remains, no gear, just empty space where someone used to be. I asked Miles how many of those cases were solo hikers. He said most. Then I asked how many disappeared within 5 miles of the ridge. He paused. 6, maybe 7. I looked at the photos. The missing, the lost. And I said it before I even meant to. Has anyone ever considered this isn't random? Miles didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "There was talk among the older rangers. Quiet talk. No reports. No proof. But he'd wondered. He had. Even back then." That afternoon I stood again at the overlook near Daniel's tent. I looked out across the trees. So much space. So many shadows. If someone had been watching the trails for years, how many places could they have hidden? I whispered Daniel's name. The wind didn't answer. 2 days later, I followed a hunch to the Jackson County Records Office in Medford. I was looking for a single file, one that had never sat right with me. A photographer named Susan Klinger had disappeared in 1982. Her camera bag was recovered, but the reports all said the film was missing. Still in one of the old folders Miles gave me, I'd noticed a receipt evidence logged for a damaged Olympus with 35mm film intact. Yet no photos were ever processed. No record of development. No lab listed. After 4 hours of digging through archive boxes, I found it. Box 14B, 1982. Inside a cracked Olympus and a sealed yellow Kodak canister labeled KLNN082. I drove it straight to a specialty lab in Eugene. The technician warned me it could be blank, or degraded, or gold. 3 days later, he called. He didn't say what was on it, just that I needed to come in person. The film was old grainy, but 3 final frames stood out. The first showed the lake wide and distant. The second was closer, a wooden shrine. The same kind I saw in the forest. Same painted stone. The third caught me off guard. A man. Just off center. Blurred by movement but clearly watching from the trees. Not Daniel. Too broad. Too still. One arm lifted holding something. Not a bag, not a camera. Maybe a tool, maybe a weapon. The technician looked nervous. He said, "I've developed a lot of film. Never ended like this." As I walked out with the prints, I whispered something under my breath. "You saw him too, Susan." And I started to wonder how many others had. When I laid those photographs across the conference table at the ranger station, the room went still. There were only 3 of us in there, me, Miles, and a young seasonal ranger who'd helped uncover Daniel's camp. He was new enough to still look uneasy around the word missing. When he pointed to the figure in the last frame, the one standing partially obscured behind the trees, he asked if it could be Daniel. I didn't even have to look again to know it wasn't. The build was wrong, the posture. The way the man's head was angled, not surprised, not caught off guard, just watching. Miles leaned in and asked quietly, "Where did this come from?" I told him about Susan Klinger, about the Olympus camera that sat in an evidence box for 15 years unclaimed, about the inconsistencies in the report and the receipt that said the film was intact even though no one had ever developed it. I didn't expect anyone to care back in 1982. I think someone made sure they didn't. Miles said nothing for a long moment. Then he ran his finger along the edge of the final photograph and said, "If she saw him out there, maybe Daniel did too." I said, "And then what?" There was no answer. Later that night, I stayed at a small lodge near the southern entrance of the park. One of those places with outdated curtains and a radiator that hummed like it had secrets of its own. I kept the photos next to me on the desk under a dim lamp and just stared at the grain of the film. That final image there was something in the eye of the man, the way it caught the light. You couldn't see a face, but that glint, that reflection, it felt knowing. Like whoever was behind that tree understood he was being seen and didn't care. I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's last journal entry. Not a ranger. Didn't wave back. Still watching. What if they were looking at the same man? What if he had been out there longer than anyone realized? The next morning, we returned to the clearing where Daniel's tent had been found. We had the photos with us, comparing the tree line, the ridge lines, anything that might give us a clue. One of the rangers, a woman who'd grown up near the park, noticed something further north. A second trail barely visible beneath the brush. This one wasn't natural. There were cut marks on the branches, old but deliberate. We followed it slowly, the group fanning out just wide enough to keep each other in view. Half a mile in the path, narrowed around a cluster of thick cedar. And that's where we found it, a lean-to structure built into the slope so well camouflaged it was almost invisible until we were standing right on top of it. The roof had collapsed in places, but enough remained to show it had once been lived in. Not camped. Lived. There was an old pan blackened by soot, a pair of broken binoculars, a cup filled with decayed leaves. Nothing shiny, nothing accidental. Whoever stayed here had been careful, intentional. Miles crouched beside the remnants of a fire ring and said, "This wasn't Daniel's. He was right. It was too far from the ridge, too permanent. This wasn't where someone passed through. This was where someone stayed and watched." Beneath a loose stone along the far edge of the lean-to, we found a small pouch sealed with tape. Inside were photographs, 7 of them, all taken from the overlook at Hematite Ridge, all from different times of day. Surveillance. I recognized the landscape. In 2 of the images, blurry but visible, were people. A figure near the edge, a woman with short hair holding what looked like a notebook. My knees gave a little. I sat down on a rock before I could fall. "That's me," I said. "That was the first year I came here, 13 years ago." Miles said nothing at first. Then quietly he said, "Whoever lived here, they weren't just watching hikers. They were watching the overlook. Repeatedly. It wasn't just unsettling. It felt patient, like whoever had taken those photos was waiting for something or someone to return." That evening, back at the ranger station, Miles pulled a binder from a locked drawer. It wasn't a standard file, no case number, just a label, Inquiries Not Pursued Remote Incidents. He told me it was assembled in the early 80s by a supervisor who'd quietly retired. Inside were memos, ranger notes, hand-drawn maps with circled regions, and one name that appeared more than once, H. Clemens. There wasn't much detail. A 1981 sighting logged by a ranger named Tom Ellison mentioned a man without a permit carrying a pack declining assistance. A second entry from 1982 near the northeast rim recorded a volunteer team spotting a bearded man who turned and walked into the trees without a word. The most recent memo from 1984, just months before Daniel disappeared, described a solo male possibly in his 50s with a gray beard seen watching hikers near Cleetwood Cove. No confrontation, no action recommended. The summary marked him as a probable long-term squatter. The language was casual, disengaged, like the park had accepted this man as just another part of the terrain. I stared at those pages and asked Miles, why didn't they do anything? He looked tired when he said it. No laws broken, no weapons, no victims, nothing they could act on. But that wasn't the full truth. They hadn't wanted to look harder. Because if they found something, they'd have to name it. And if they named it, they'd have to explain why they'd ignored it. Miles copied the whole file before locking the original away. Then he called me later that night. "I think I found him," he said. "The man in the photo, the one from Susan's roll, from Daniel's journal, from the lean-to." I asked, "Does he have a name?" "We think it's Clemens." "No first name, just sightings. No ID, but I've got something to cross-reference." The next morning, I drove to the Public Records Office in Eugene. I asked about land transfers, military records, anything tied to the name Clemens. Most were dead ends. But eventually I found one, Howard Clemens, born 1923, Lake County, Oregon. Forestry surveyor. Retired in 1977. Bought a cabin outside of Prospect, not far from the park's southern edge. Stopped paying property taxes in 1979. By 1980, the cabin was seized. No forwarding address. No listed relatives. It looked like he'd simply vanished. But he hadn't. He'd gone into the forest. I showed the file to Miles that afternoon. He traced a finger along the dates, the maps, the final sighting in 1987. Then he said, "That's the year the disappearances stopped." I said nothing, because we were both thinking the same thing. If Clemens had been living in those woods for years and then died, then who had been watching us since the last confirmed sighting of Clemens came from a man named Don Weaver? Miles tracked him down through an old ranger directory. Don had retired in '89 and was living alone in a small trailer outside Grants Pass. He was in his 70s now, hunched with eyes that didn't miss much. When we sat with him beneath a crooked pine behind his trailer, he listened without interrupting. Then he said, "You're asking about the ghost." He poured coffee into mismatched enamel mugs and told us he'd seen Clemens in the fall of '87 from Windmere Lookout. Fog was rolling in thick and fast, and he was sweeping the northwest ridge through his field glasses. That's when he noticed movement tall man, long coat, not moving like a hiker, just standing still, staring straight at the tower. Don kept watching for 15 minutes. No binoculars on the other end. No motion. Just a presence. Then the fog swallowed him. He said he logged it, but no one followed up. His supervisor chalked it up to light distortion. Don hadn't pushed the matter, but after that he said strange things began to happen. Stones stacked in odd patterns at the base of the tower, fresh scratches on rocks. Once a dead raccoon laid out on the steps, not mutilated, just arranged. When I asked if he'd ever felt like he was being watched, he didn't hesitate. Always. As we left, he touched my arm and said, "If your brother crossed paths with him, he wouldn't have had a chance." That evening back at the ranger station, Miles pulled out the coordinates Don had recorded in '87. They traced a line with the other missing person sites, Daniel's among them. What caught my eye wasn't the individual locations. It was the pattern. They formed a crescent along the western rim, and every one of them pointed back toward a spot on the map labeled Bare Needle Hollow. It had been removed from trail guides after a rock slide in the late '80s made it too dangerous. Officially, the area was listed as unstable and closed to hikers. Miles looked at the topography and said, "It's a natural bowl. Hidden from above, hard to reach from below." He paused, then added, "A perfect place to disappear." We left at dawn with 2 rangers and enough gear for a day's trek. The forest thickened quickly. Most of the trail had been overtaken by new growth roots pulling up old markers, moss covering anything man-made. After a few hours, the terrain dropped. The incline wasn't steep at first, but the farther we went, the colder it got. Birds fell silent. Pine needles dampened our steps. We passed through a narrow break in the trees, and then we saw it. A ruined cabin collapsed in on itself, but still recognizable by the outline of its foundation. The roof had caved in long ago. Rodents had shredded whatever fabric remained. But the walls, the old beams, those were hand-hewn, not milled. There was a hinge still bolted to a post rusted through. Miles knelt in front of one of the remaining planks and ran his hand over the wood. Then he nodded at me. There, carved deep into the grain, were the initials HC. We found a sealed box tucked beneath a stone along the far wall. Inside a notebook, brittle but legible, a knife worn down to a sliver, and a photograph faded, folded in half, of a woman standing beside a truck. On the back, in ink, nearly vanished, it said Margaret, 1952. The notebook was full of observations. No names, no stories, just details. Saw hiker with blue pack. Waited until night to move. Fire brings them. Avoid mornings. It read like a log written by someone who didn't want to be found, who understood how to disappear and how to watch. Toward the end, one line caught my breath. The boy asked me my name. I said nothing. He looked like he knew me. I turned away. I didn't say Daniel's name. I didn't have to. Miles just nodded and sealed the book back in the pouch. We thought that was it. We thought the story had ended there. But on our way out, one of the younger rangers slipped on a patch of shale and caught himself on a low branch. Right where his hand landed was a strip of nylon bright orange torn. It was wedged under a root half buried. The color was unmistakable. Daniel's backpack had been that color. We started digging. The soil was packed, laced with stone. Within minutes we found the remains of a shattered frame, a crushed compass, a rusted film canister with the lid still intact, a notebook soaked through but mostly whole. My hands shook when I lifted it. I recognized his handwriting immediately. It was Daniel's. The entries were brief. Weather. Trail notes. One small line, faded but clear. He told me he used to be someone else. The page had been torn near the bottom. We kept moving. The ravine narrowed the path, growing more treacherous with every step. Then, in a clearing, no wider than a bedroom, we found it. A shallow mound disturbed at one end, framed with stones that had once marked a grave. The wood was gone. The cross, whatever it had been, had long since rotted, but the body was still there. Human remains, compact, a wool coat in pieces, and around the neck a rusted dog tag. Miles brushed away the soil and read the inscription aloud. Clemens H., U.S. Army, 1944. So there it was. Clemens had died there. Alone. Buried maybe by weather, maybe by someone else. But the body wasn't recent. That coat had been underground for years, which meant something else, something colder. If Clemens had died in that ravine, then who had been seen near Windmere Tower? Who left the patterns of stones? Who carved the initials near my brother's camp? We stood in the clearing, listening. The wind was low. No animals stirred. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that someone else had come after, that Daniel had met someone but not the man we thought. As we packed the items into evidence bags, Miles glanced up toward the slope. His voice was quiet. We've been chasing the wrong man. I didn't respond. Not then. But something inside me shifted. The fear didn't come from knowing Clemens was gone. It came from realizing someone else had stepped into the quiet he left behind. And he had been watching us the whole time. The morning after we found Clemens' grave, I sat in the Ranger HQ archives room alone. I hadn't slept. I kept replaying the way the soil gave way, how the tag had surfaced, how the coat disintegrated at the seams. It should have brought closure, but it didn't. Instead, it opened something wider. If Clemens had died there in that hollow sometime before the last known sighting in 1987, then whoever had stood watching the overlook years later wasn't him. And Daniel in 1984 had spoken to someone. That part was in his notebook. I couldn't forget the phrasing. He told me he used to be someone else. That wasn't the language of fear. It was someone trying to make sense of what he was seeing, and that led me to wonder if someone else, someone newer, had stepped into the woods around the time Clemens faded out. I asked Miles for access to the old incident logs from 1980 to 1984. Not the reports that made it to law enforcement, just the informal ones. The ranger notes, the scraps of paper, and journal entries that didn't make it into the official counts. It took hours to sort through them. Most were routine injuries, bad weather hikers going off trail. But then I found two cases I hadn't seen before. Both were marked as presumed terrain-related fatalities. Both were young men in their 20s. Solo travelers. The first, a man named Stephen Caro, was last seen in June 1980. The second, a drifter named Michael Lantry, had disappeared in late August of 1981. There was little documentation, just enough to confirm that their vehicles had been found in the same lot where Daniel's was parked 3 years later. No gear recovered. No signs of struggle. Just absence. But what stopped me was a margin note in one of the ranger logs from 1981. It mentioned that Clemens had spoken with a lone hiker near Cleetwood Trail, gave him water, warned him about the cliffs. The note didn't even mention the hiker's name, but the timeline matched. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw Michael Lantry, and now we had reason to believe Clemens had died just a few years later, which meant Michael might not have vanished. He might have stayed. I called Miles and told him everything. He didn't push back. He just said, "Let's go back to the hollow." That afternoon we returned with more staff. This time, instead of focusing on the ravine and cabin, we expanded the perimeter northward. If someone had taken over Clemens' shelter or even built a second one nearby, there had to be signs. The ground was thick with debris, fallen branches, moss, frost, brittle undergrowth, but it didn't take long to start finding things. Traps, primitive old. A metal snare rusted through at the hinge. A tarp shelter partially collapsed but clearly placed with intent. And beneath a moss-covered rock, a sealed tin. Inside were bones, small animal, feathers, and 7 carved wooden tokens. Crude figures each about the size of a thumb, each with a single slash across the face. No eyes, just blank ovals, no mouths, just the gouge. Miles lined them up on a rock. He didn't say anything at first. Then he said, "Someone made these deliberately. You don't carve 7 of anything unless it means something." I turned one over in my palm. The wood was dark smooth at the base, rough at the top where the features should have been. I felt something hollow in my chest. Not horror, exactly. Something colder. Then came the radio call. A ranger posted on the northern ridge had found something else, a stone circle deliberately built, and at its center a wooden post. When we arrived, I saw it wasn't new. The post was blackened in places, weathered to the point of cracking, but still upright. A square of cloth faded orange was tied to the top with leather cord. I didn't have to guess where that fabric came from. It was the same color as Daniel's pack. I stepped closer and saw what had been carved into the post. Not one set of initials. Dozens. All the same. DW. 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 Scratched in with something sharp, unevenly spaced, some nearly invisible. The lower ones had been worn by wind and water. The higher ones looked newer. Miles said softly. He kept coming back. I ran my hand along the surface, and then I noticed something else. Symbols, not letters. Simple geometric. A spiral. A square. And a crude human figure with no face. Primitive but intentional. "These aren't trail signs," I said. Miles agreed. The next morning, the park anthropologist Dr. Lyndon Ash flew in. She'd cataloged dozens of sites throughout the Pacific Northwest, and when she examined the carvings, her expression shifted from curiosity to something more guarded. "These aren't indigenous," she said. "They're invented. By someone untrained but deliberate. Ritual language." I asked what the symbols might mean. She said the spiral could represent return or entrapment a loop. The square might be shelter. And the faceless figure. "That's either the watcher," she said quietly, "or the one being watched." As we widened the search around the circle, we found another arrangement, stones shaped into a low arch and beneath them a shallow pit. Bones inside, not human, but always paired. One large one, small, facing each other, like a mirror, like memory. I crouched beside them and whispered, "He was recreating people." Miles didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Or replacing them." Back at headquarters that night, I laid the wooden figurines out again. 7 in total. 6 had slashed faces, 1 didn't. That one was smoother, taller, carved from a different type of wood, untouched. "What if this one is Daniel?" I said. I don't know why I said it aloud. Maybe I needed to hear the words spoken to feel the weight of them. Before Miles could respond, the phone rang. He picked it up, listened, then turned toward me with eyes that looked suddenly awake. That roll of film from Daniel's pack. The lab called. "There's a clear frame." I stood up. "What's on it?" He paused. "A fire, a tent, and someone else in the background. A man." My mouth was dry. "Is it Daniel?" Miles shook his head. "It's not Daniel. He's being watched." I didn't say anything. I just stared at the unmarked figurine and thought if Daniel was still out there, he hadn't disappeared. He'd been seen, and now maybe he'd left something behind to be found. The lab technician's name was Elias Harper. Soft-spoken, early 40s hands that moved with a kind of reverence over the old equipment. The room where we met was dim save for the white glare of the projection screen. Miles stood beside me, arms crossed, saying nothing. Elias adjusted the focus until the frame filled the wall. At first glance, it was familiar Daniel's campsite, the fire ring intact, the tent behind it. But what drew all 3 of us forward was the shape between the trees, barely there at first, then obvious. A man half obscured by branches. He wasn't facing the camera directly. His left shoulder was turned, head slightly lowered, but his eye had caught the flash. That small glint, the reflection in one eye, was the only part of his face not lost to shadow. Elias enhanced the contrast slowly, careful not to overexpose it. As the shape sharpened, more details emerged. A thick beard, long matted hair, a scar, faint but visible, cutting diagonally across the cheek. His jacket looked worn military style. Something was strapped across his chest, maybe a harness or bag, but it was hard to tell. Miles leaned in. "That's not Daniel," he said. "And he's not just passing through." I asked if the image could be cleaned further, if we could get anything clearer from the shadows. Elias ran the image through a few filters, sharpening edges, reducing noise. The shape held, nothing more revealed, just that same eye glinting. Watching. "We can work with that," Miles said quietly. We left with a copy of the frame and the digital scans. Back at Ranger HQ, we spent the next several hours going through missing persons archives, incident reports, and arrest records, anything that might match the features in the photo. I started with the scar. It was a long shot, but it gave us something. I cross-referenced Ranger reports from the early 80s and found a mugshot from 1980. Michael Lantry, 26 years old, arrested for illegal camping and vandalism outside Jackson County. Charges were dropped, but the report listed one identifying feature, a diagonal scar on the right cheek. I printed the photo. The face was younger, cleaner, no beard, but the structure held. The scar was identical. "He didn't vanish," I said aloud. He stayed. Miles didn't argue. He pulled up a map and marked the last known location of Lantry's car, Cleetwood Cove, the same lot Daniel had used. If Lantry had entered the woods in 1981 and never came back out, he'd had 3 years to find Clemens, to watch him, to learn from him, to become something else. What if he didn't just follow Clemens, I said. What if he took his place? The next morning we returned to Bare Needle Hollow, this time with a clearer objective. Find the shelter in the photo. We'd already seen the fire ring in Daniel's frame. The tent behind it had collapsed, but the composition suggested a nearby ledge, something elevated just enough for a shot from behind the trees. It took most of the morning to find it. The footpath wasn't marked, just a faint thread through the pine needles worn by repetition. A human route, not an animal trail. Someone had walked it often. At the end of the path, nestled behind a moss-covered boulder, was a hollow, inside the remnants of another camp, a long-dead fire pit. Bark peeled from the inside of logs, a stack of notebooks warped by time but still legible. Behind them, the wall of the rock face had been carved not deeply but enough to catch in the light. Dozens of tiny faces, all different. None had eyes, just sockets, rows upon rows of them etched in silence, and beneath them a phrase, repeated, over and over. You forget the face, but it never forgets you. Miles read it aloud, his voice barely carried. I opened one of the notebooks. The writing was uneven, thoughts and observations crammed into margins, names, dates, weather patterns, mentions of ranger patrols, campers with blue packs. One page had a crude drawing Daniel, sitting beside a fire, his face scratched out. We didn't speak for a while after that. We left the notebooks intact and carried them back to HQ in evidence bags. The lab scanned them under infrared. One phrase hidden in charcoal repeated near the edges of several pages. She's coming. She always comes. I froze when I read that. I hadn't told anyone I was returning to Crater Lake. Not beyond a few close friends. No press, no interviews. Whoever wrote those words hadn't guessed I'd been expected. That night I couldn't sleep. I laid out the timeline from Daniel's final notebook and compared it to the new entries. The man in the woods, Lantry, or whoever he'd become, had tracked Daniel's movements. He noted when he boiled water, when he walked the ridge, what he packed. But the entries ended abruptly. The final one read, July 16th. I had to choose. Beneath it, almost invisible without blacklight, another line. One stays, one sees. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a decision. That afternoon, we went back to the original cabin, the one we believed had belonged to Clemens. Parts of the floor had held up. I tapped along the boards until I heard it hollow near the back wall. Beneath it, wrapped in waxed cloth, was an old audio reel. We took it to a nearby college where they still had the equipment to play it back. The sound was warped, filled with static. But the voice cut through. A man, raspy, deliberate. He keeps talking in his sleep, keeps saying my name. But he doesn't know me. He doesn't know I was watching. Sometimes I wonder if he sees me. Not out there. In here. Inside the dark part of the fire. A pause. Then more. I never wanted to hurt him. I just wanted him to understand. But he ran. He ran into the trees. So I followed. They always run. And she always comes. The tape ended. No name. No place. Just that voice. I asked the technician to rewind it. We listened again, and this time the silence between the words felt heavier, more intentional, like someone was speaking for an audience they couldn't see. Later, Miles and I stood at Windmere Tower watching the trees. The light was going slow and golden. You could see the lake from up there, still glassy, untouched. But it was the forest that pulled your eye, the shape of it, the way it breathed without wind. I placed the unmarked figurine, Daniel's, I believed, at the edge of the railing, facing the trees. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Below us, deep in the green, something moved. Not a sound. Not a flash. Just the brief impression of motion. Of someone watching still. I reached for the radio. My hand hovered. But I didn't press it. Not yet. Because something in me understood we weren't hunting anyone anymore. We'd been invited. It was just after 7 p.m. when I left the lookout tower. The light was thinning fast and the ridge trail felt narrower than I remembered. The sky had that heavy blue-gray tint that always settles in over Crater Lake when the sun drops too quickly behind the ridge. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I wanted to keep my vision adjusted to the dark. Every few steps I glanced back at the trees below the tower. Nothing moved, but that didn't mean I was alone. The quiet had a texture to it now, like breath held in a deep chest. At the fork where the ridgeline trail broke toward the old game path, I stopped. Miles had told me not to move, but something had shifted in me. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't fear. It was invitation. I stepped off the main trail and moved down into the denser part of the forest, following the curve of that game path. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the air itself was drawing inward. No wind, no bird song, just the sound of my boots on pine. And then 3 notes, a whistle, soft, evenly spaced, almost musical. It came from up ahead. I didn't pause. I kept walking. The trail widened into a clearing I didn't recognize. At its center was a flat stone, broad and low like an altar. On top of it sat a leather-bound journal and a photograph. I stepped closer. The photo was of Daniel, but not the Daniel I remembered. This man was older, leaner hair, longer, face drawn. He looked tired, but he looked alive. His eyes were focused on something behind the camera like he was listening to a voice out of frame. I picked it up with shaking fingers. On the back, written in pencil so faint it was nearly gone. He let me go. But I never left. I was still holding the photograph when I heard a voice behind me. I didn't take him. It was a man's voice. Dry. Low. I turned slowly. A figure stepped from between 2 trees, his face half in shadow. He wore a long coat, heavy and worn like it had survived too many winters. His beard was streaked with gray. His eyes were sunken but steady. I asked Michael Lantry. He didn't answer, just nodded once, then looked at the journal. He wrote that after I told him everything. I asked, "Told him what?" He took a slow breath. That the world out there had rules, noise, names. In here, you can forget who you were. He stepped closer, but not too close. He wanted that. I looked down at the photograph again. Is he still alive? Michael didn't speak for a moment. Then he turned his head slightly toward the trees. He was. Maybe still is. But not like before. The next thing he said was quiet. You shouldn't look for him anymore. I asked him why. He didn't answer. I could see something in his posture shift, like the conversation was over. He turned and disappeared back into the dark between the trees. I didn't follow. I waited. Then I sat down beside the altar stone and opened the journal. It was Daniel's handwriting. The first page was dated 3 weeks after he'd disappeared. It described waking up near the ridge, disoriented, unsure of time. The next few pages were short notes, weather patterns. What he ate, how often he heard someone whistling in the woods. Then came longer entries, thoughts about silence, about how stillness wasn't the absence of sound, but the drowning of memory. He described a man who never said his name, just called himself the one who stayed. Daniel never wrote about trying to leave. He only wrote about not knowing why he hadn't. One entry stood out. It read, "Some nights he watches the fire with me, doesn't speak, just sits. When he leaves, it feels like I go with him, even when I don't move." The journal ended with a single line, "She always comes." I closed it gently. Then I looked around the clearing again. There were no markings, no stones, no carved posts this time, just pine needles and that wide, low stone in the center. I left the photograph where I found it. I took the journal. The hike back was quiet. I didn't hear the whistle again, but I felt the weight of that man's presence long after I left the tree line. The next day I gave the journal to Miles. He read it front to back slowly, carefully. Then he looked at me and said, This was never about a crime scene. I nodded. This was a decision. He asked if I believed Daniel had chosen to stay. I told him I didn't know, but I believed someone had given him a choice. That afternoon, I drove alone to the ridge one last time. I didn't bring a camera. I didn't bring anyone with me. I just stood at the edge of that overlook, the same place Daniel had last seen the lake. The water was still. The sky over it was a soft, weightless gray. At my feet, I placed his figurine, upright in the dirt. I left the photo beneath it, tucked against the base of a stone. Not as evidence, not as closure, just as acknowledgement, as memory. Behind me, somewhere deep in the woods, a whistle sounded. 3 notes. Faint. Unhurried. Then silence. I stood there until the wind changed, until the trees stopped holding their breath. Then I turned and started back down the trail. I didn't look behind me. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in 13 years, I didn't feel like I was chasing a disappearance. I was leaving a message. And I knew someone would hear it. The days that followed felt suspended, as if the trees themselves were holding on to the last secrets, refusing to let them slip into sunlight. I returned to Ranger headquarters carrying Daniel's journal and the photo Michael had left in the clearing. The air in the office had changed, word had spread among the staff, and for the first time in years, people were speaking Daniel's name in the present tense, not as a ghost, but as someone who might still belong to these woods. Miles met me at the door, his expression drawn, but resolute. He'd spent the night reviewing every piece of evidence, every old map and timeline, cross-checking sightings and disappearances, making sure nothing slipped past us this time. "We're not going to let this go quiet," he said, and I believed him. Together we documented everything, every figurine, every stone pattern, every carved post and journal entry, all of it cataloged and photographed and boxed. Law enforcement from Jackson County and the State Patrol were called in for a formal review. They walked the site at Bare Needle Hollow, mapped the perimeters, questioned staff, and finally, by the week's end, declared the hollow closed to the public and a restricted site. There would be no tours, no memorials, no news crews. Just an unmarked patch on the map cordoned off by yellow tape and an understanding among those who worked these woods that something had changed. The official story, when it came out, was cautious. A missing person presumed dead. An investigation, ongoing evidence of possible long-term habitation, no sign of foul play, no suspect. But in the ranger community, the story traveled differently. The new staff were told not to go off trail. The old staff, the ones who'd stayed silent for years, came forward in quiet moments and shared their own stories, shadows at dusk. Strange whistles campsites that seemed occupied but empty by morning. I started getting letters at my bookstore in San Francisco, handwritten notes from people who'd lost brothers, sons, fathers, to the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Not everyone vanished at Crater Lake. Some disappeared in Olympic, some in the Cascades, some in places with no name at all. The stories shared a common thread, a final postcard, a note, a sense of withdrawal, then silence. Miles and I tried to push the investigation further, but the state was reluctant. The bones we'd found were decades old. The dog tags confirmed Clemen's fate, and Michael Lantry, if he was still alive, was a ghost in the system. No prints, no taxes, no medical records. No one wanted to say out loud that people could vanish and simply become the next shadow waiting in the trees. For weeks I wondered if I'd failed Daniel. If I'd let my brother become another story the park wanted to disappear. I visited the lookout tower every evening, sometimes alone, sometimes with Miles. Some nights we'd hear the 3-note whistle drifting up from the hollow. Other times it was only the wind or the steady hum of insects or the creak of trees settling in the cooling air. Each time I thought I heard Daniel's voice, it was really only memory, but memory is a stubborn thing. I began to realize that justice in a place like this wasn't the same as closure. There would be no arrest, no trial, no neat ending. But what we did have the evidence, the documentation, the voices recorded in notebooks and photos, would not be forgotten. We made sure of that. The site at Bare Needle Hollow was sealed off, and the ranger logbooks changed. Every new ranger was briefed on what had happened, not the version for the press, but the one that would keep them alive if they heard a whistle or saw a figure in the woods that didn't belong. Jackson County agreed to keep the case open, but unofficially everyone understood that the answers we found were as close as we'd ever come. I stopped searching the woods for Daniel. I started searching in the places he'd loved, the library where he read as a child, the old pier at the edge of the city, the mountain trails we'd walked before he ever dreamed of Crater Lake. I let the park return to what it had always been, untamed, unpredictable, and full of stories that didn't end the way anyone wanted. Sometimes late at night I'd stand on my porch in San Francisco 1,000 miles away and listen for a whistle on the wind. I never heard it, but I always remembered. On the anniversary of Daniel's disappearance, Miles sent me a photograph. It was the figurine I'd left at the overlook, still upright, untouched by weather, surrounded by pine needles and a scatter of small stones. There were no footprints, no sign anyone had moved it. Just the sense that somehow the forest itself had accepted this offering and, maybe in some quiet way, had let my brother's story settle into its roots. That was the closest I came to peace. Not justice as the world sees it, but the kind that lives in silence, where those who listen closely enough might still hear the echo of a name carried by wind through the pines. That was where I chose to leave it for now. The last time I stood at the edge of Crater Lake, autumn was moving in fast. The pines held a chill that went right through my coat, and the water below was as still as a photograph. In that silence, I understood that not all stories end with answers. Some are carried on the wind, changing shape as they're remembered and retold. When I look back on the years I spent searching for Daniel, first as a sister desperate for fact, then as someone who finally learned to listen to silence, I realize I was never just chasing a missing person. I was learning how people vanish not only from maps and photographs, but from the lives that once held them. I was learning how the world goes quiet around a loss until you make yourself hear it again. Daniel is still gone. Some nights I hear the old whistle, 3 notes echoing somewhere deep in memory. Sometimes it feels like an invitation, other times a warning. But mostly I let it be. Miles still calls every few months, never with news, only to say he was up at the tower and thought of Daniel or heard a story from a new ranger about a shadow in the trees. The park moves on. The old staff retire, new faces come in, and the official records sit locked in drawers, but I keep the journal on my shelf at home. I keep the figurine too, just a small token, now worn by weather, a marker that Daniel lived and that he mattered. When strangers ask about my brother, I don't speak in mysteries anymore. I tell them he loved wild places, and sometimes wild places keep their own. I tell them what matters is not how someone disappears, but how they are remembered. Justice in this story never looked like handcuffs or headlines. It looked like holding on to what's true and letting the rest settle where it must. I'm older now. The ache of those years is quieter, not gone, but changed. If you followed this story all the way here, thank you. If you carry a name that's missing or a memory that won't let you go, I hope you find a way to honor it, even if no one else understands. And if you hear a whistle in the dark, pause, listen, remember. Some echoes aren't meant to be lost. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll share it or leave a thought below. Every voice helps keep a name alive, even when the woods are silent.